Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're enjoying the Duskmourn meta. We're into week 2, and we're starting to see we're still seeing new innovations. So actually, we're seeing an old version of a deck come back. Mono White Control has shown up in the best of 3 scene as well as the best of 1 scene. So we'll be covering that one today. And just wanted to take a second and say, like, the meta is really diverse. I've played Magic the Gathering when there was one competitive deck. And so seeing a good spread of aggro, midrange, tempo, control between best of 1 and best of 3 is fantastic. And best of 1 is always going to be dominated by aggro, but we're still seeing some control make it into best of 1 as well. So with that, let's get started. All right, so first up, what I like to do here, if you're new, is I use a tracker called Untapped as a way to kind of look at what the best performing deck is for Bronze to Mythic, and it's a way to remove my bias and just go off of what does the tracker say is working for the most amount of people. And what I like to do is I like to track the changes throughout the weeks so that we can kind of talk about what some alternatives are and why the cards are coming in against other decks in the meta. And then also kind of give you a rundown of what the good matchups are and the bad matchups are for each deck. It's especially useful if you are returning to the meta after some time. So first up here, we've got number 1, according to Untapped, is Boros Auras, and it was number 1 last week. I think it's the top performing deck. A lot of the people who hit the early top 100 Mythic in week 1 were running Boros Auras, and looking at the tracker, the majority of people in the top performing decks in Mythic as well is Boros Auras. So this archetype is definitely here to stay. The question is what little tweaks can we do to improve it? So if you watched my video yesterday where I talked about the meta breakers, I usually talk about off meta picks, and this week there weren't any off meta picks. So there will be next week. Even by Sunday afternoon, actually, we saw some kind of creative ones meet my criteria. But that being said, yesterday I talked about like the 2 versions that hit Mythic that had dropped Atali's favor. If I can remember correctly, one was to bring in 2 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, and then the other one was a 61 card list that was bringing in 3 copies of Warsqueak. And it was pointed out that like Hammerhand is basically just a better version than Warsqueak. So if you are running the Warsqueak, play with Hammerhand because it lets you target your own creatures with the target creature can't block as a way to trigger your Valiant for Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger. So I'm a little bit rambly on this one. I'll get to the point here. So the deck is centered off of the red core of the mouse synergies of Heartfire Hero, Emberheart Challenger, and Manifold Mouse. And compared to last week, what we can see is we've dropped 1 copy of the Feather of Flight to bring in 1 copy of Demonic Ruckus. And I like the Demonic Ruckus being included in a higher number, personally, just because usually you want to keep your Shard Mage's Rescue up when you actually play one of your 1-drops. The exception is Rakdos Aggro, where you want to be able to do a turn 2 Sheltered by Ghosts to be able to remove their Cacophony Scamp to prevent the turn 2 win. And but Sheltered by Ghosts single-handedly defeats many strategies that are unable to remove it, and if you can protect your dude with the Shard Mage's Rescue, that even more, further seals the deal. And it's kind of a Voltron deck where you try to make something just absolutely massive, putting the ethereal armor on it. Monstrous Rage is the only spell in this that's not an enchantment or a permanent, but it also creates a monster roll, which is a token enchantment, which then also triggers things like the Optimistic Scavenger. And Atali's Favor is in here because all of these are decent hits to get off of the Discover 3. And then it's another way to give one of your creatures trample so that they can't just chump block your giant double striking mouse, for example. As far as the lands go, we do see some changes here as well. So they dropped the 2 copies of the Thran Portal to bring in an additional copy of the Mountain and Plains. And because of the life gain off of the Sheltered by Ghosts, I think the Thran Portal runs okay. But again, that's why I use the tracker to remove my bias. As far as the matchups go, this one is very favored against Azorius Oculus, which we'll be covering here in a second. It's a coin flip against Rakdos Aggro, really coming down to if they're on the play, then you don't have a way to prevent their turn 2 win, and if you're on the play, then they have a hard time beating your turn 2 Sheltered by Ghosts. So The weakness to this deck is Mono Black Discard, and Mono Black Discard did not make it into the top 8 this week. It has some bad matchups, but the fact that as this deck grows in popularity, because what we're seeing is Rakdos Aggro was at like 30%, and now Boros Auras and Rakdos Aggro are now both at about 15% of the meta. And so if we can continue to see Boros Auras rise, which I think we will, then that's going to make Mono Black Discard perform better. Second is Azorius Oculus, and so this is the deck that the Boros Auras deck is good against, and this was number 2 according to Untapped. And if we look at this list, no card, not even a land, nothing has changed from week 1. So just really quickly, what you're trying to do is reanimate either the Haughty Djinn or the Abhorrent Oculus with Recommission or Helping Hand, and you can get them into the graveyard or put them into the graveyard through Moment of Truth, so that you can discard it from your hand with Chart a Course. You can just mill it in with Moment of Truth or Picklock Prankster, and then you've got some disruption with the Phantom Interference and the 3 steps ahead with the Into the Floodmaw. And again, if you want to look at the best of 1 meta breakers that I talked about on Saturday, we went over some mythic decks that had kind of tweaked in Elspeth Smite and Afara's Dispersal and Temporary Lockdown to improve the matchup against the Rakdos Aggro decks and the Boros Auras deck. Because the Boros Auras deck struggles a little bit with the Temporary Lockdown because it wipes basically everything in the deck. That being said, this deck is good against Mono Black Discard, so it's going to be one of the problems that Mono Black Discard has to face if we're looking at the rock, paper, scissors. This one does relatively well against, if they make you discard your Djinn, you're just like happy that they did that. It's weak to Rakdos Aggro and Boros Auras. Again, can be improved upon, but I still think that the base structure and strategy of the deck is going to be weak against those 2 matchups. Number 3 is Mono White Control, and this one is the new one that has been showing up in the best of 3 tournament scene, and then also showing up in best of 1. And so according to the tracker, it is number 3 in the best of 1 meta between Bronze and Mythic. And this one, it has no new cards from Duskmourn. I do think that we have some like Enduring Curiosity and things like that will probably make its way into this archetype, and we'll see in best of 3 some ideas being explored. And but basically it's the Builder's Talent deck, where you're centered off of like the Carrot Cake and the Caretaker's Talent, where every time a token enters, you draw cards. So you draw off of like Sanguine Evangelist, you draw off of the tokens created by the Archangel Elspeth, the tokens created off Carrot Cake, Beza, the Bounding Spring for life gain, as well as creating more tokens. You've got the Sunfall to wrath the board, and then Virtue of Loyalty to kind of pump your board if it does become a very mid-rangey, grindy matchup. Otherwise, it's just a flash 2/2 instant created 2/2 token that then triggers your Caretaker's Talent. And you've got the Eternal Wanderer, which allows you to blink your cards that have interesting ETBs like Beza, as well as being able to wrath the board and just, being a win condition in and of itself. So you've got Get Lost and Lay Down Arms as the interaction. So, this is your hope against Rakdos Aggro. And then Lay Down Arms also works relatively well against the aggro strategies, being able to, it is sorcery speed, but you can still use it to remove their Heartfire hero and such. So it's preying on Rakdos Aggro, I think, quite heavily. And that one is still one of it's the most popular pick, might become the second most popular pick. But right now is quite prevalent in the meta. And this one also does well against Mono Black Discard. So number 2 and number 3 are kind of offsetting the counter to Boros Auras, which I think is what makes Boros Auras perform better. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras itself, and kind of depending on how you can get around their... You don't have a whole lot of interaction in this deck, and they don't have a whole lot of interaction in their deck either. The Sunfall, if you can survive to it, is a good way to kind of get rid of the Voltron. And then you've got Get Lost that you have to play around the protection spell. So it is weak to Azorius Oculus, not really being able to do much to prevent their... So they get a large Haughty Djinn out, and then your only hope is to hit it with one of your interaction. And if they have the counter spell for it, then you're kind of in trouble. Number 4 on the list is Rakdos Aggro, and this is the turn 2 and turn 3 win as quickly as you can. And I think the speed of the deck, as well as the cheap crafting cost, is really what draws a lot of people into the Rakdos Aggro archetype. But it isn't the top performing deck. I think the Sheltered by Ghosts is actually a more problematic card than any of the mice that people are wanting banned or the Callous Sellsword. But it does feel really bad when you lose on turn 2 without even doing anything. So some people really, really hating this deck. And so this one was number 4 according to Untapped, and we do see some changes to the archetype. So compared to last week, we see Emberheart Challenger getting dropped by 1. This card helps you dig, but is not particularly good for the turn 3 or the turn 2 combo. Same with the Might of the Meek. So this one helps you dig if they do have an answer and kind of go later, but it itself isn't part of the turn 2 win, which needs you to get the 3 power off of like Turn Inside Out, copied by Leyline Resonance, to be able to actually hit for the 21 damage on turn 2, which you do by sacrificing the Cacophony Scamp with the Callous Sellsword or Heartfire Hero. So they deal 3 times their damage. The other way that this deck wins on turn 3 is the classic one that we've had since OTJ, which is Slickshot Show Off with 2 combat tricks. The combat tricks have to be at least 2 power, so Dreadmaw's Ire, Felonious Rage, Turn Inside Out, etc. That works for the Slickshot Show Off. You get it to power 9, fling it, it gets +2/+0 as the fling resolves and deals 11 damage. So 2 cost spells plus the fling gives you the turn 3 win. And if you have the Leyline out, you can, play a single Felonious Rage, and you don't need to have 2. So the deck's weakness is definitely the single point interaction. And the Dreadmaw's Ire was, you see this kind of come and go. So like the Felonious Rage, the Dreadmaw's Ire, we see kind of like a fluctuation. So this week we're bringing in 2 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire and running instead of the Might of the Meeks. And that helps with less dig, more consistent turn 2, turn 3. As far as the lands go, again, this deck can run with 17 or 18 lands, and you do not need to play black. So this one dropped the 3 copies of the Black Cleave Cliffs to bring in 3 additional copies of Mountains, and then brought in an additional Sulphurous Springs to run 18 instead of 17 lands. So as far as the matchups go, it's favored against Azorius Oculus. The Oculus deck is struggling to have the interaction outside of Into the Floodmaw. If we see more of the Elspeth Smite and as far as Dispersal kind of become the more popular choice, then we'll see maybe that can be improved, but I still think the Azorius Oculus is going to struggle against this deck. It's coin flip, like I mentioned, against Boros Auras, where it comes down to pretty much who has the play. And then this is weak to the Mono Black discard deck. So right now, Mono Black discard is basically preying on the 2 most popular picks while then losing to the other matches in the meta. All right, and number 5 is Azorius Control, and we see a huge rework compared to last week, and so much so that I was tempted to just call it another archetype. But in case you're returning, it's nice to know what the options are being explored, right? So last week we saw a full playset of the Horned Lock Whale. This week we're dropping 3 copies there. Bringing in the 2 copies of the Beza the Bounding Spring for a little bit of stabilization. Kutzel's Flanker as well gives us life against mono red, as well as some graveyard hate, which does matter against the Azorius Oculus deck. We've got 4 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind for the mill win condition against other control matchups, since we are starting to see more control like mono white pop up. And then we've got 2 less Sunfalls, so this kind of being too slow and there not being a lot of the Boros Tokens or Celestia Rabbits board flood strategies. I think the Sunfall is looking a little bit less well positioned, and so I like that change. We're bringing in the Silver Scrutiny, which helps up against the mono black discard. So, same with Jace, being able to mill down tick for 2 and mill them to draw a card actually works quite well at offsetting the discard. And then we have Split Up, which allows us to kind of have a cheaper Wrath, kind of like a second copy of the Temporary Lockdown. We're dropping 2 copies of the Elspeth Smite. I'm not sure I agree with that. Depends on how much you're coming up against those really aggro-y decks. This card is not great when you're up against other control matches. We've got 1 less Get Lost, and we're taking out all 4 copies of the Not On My Watch, which is another one that can kind of help up against mono red. We're dropping the 3 copies of the Spellgyre, which was one that was being explored from Bloomburrow, as a way to kind of replace the Memory Deluge. And we're bringing in 1 copy of the Destroy Evil, and this one being nice for that like enchantment hate, especially against the Boros Auras deck. You can get rid of the maybe we'll see more enchantment hate coming in to answer the Sheltered by Ghosts, because if you target the creature it has ward, but if you target the enchantment it does not. And we're bringing in 1 copy of the End of the Floodmaw as a way to kind of, you can bounce their Leyline if you want to. You can just bounce their creature after they put a bunch of combat tricks onto it. And let's see, we 1 copy of Negate, and that one's just, you know, there's a lot of spells in the meta right now. I don't think there's any really, like I mentioned, the Celestia Rabbits has fallen out of popularity, which was the most creature-centric strategy. So I think main boarding Negate actually works okay. We've got the 4 copies of the Soul Partition, which is kind of the instant of choice. Instead of removing the creature with the Not on My Watch and exiling it, if they attack, we can just exile it, and then if it basically makes it, it's like removal because they have to pay 2 more to cast it later, and then by later you should have an answer for it. And then we've got 1 less Temporary Lockdown, which I think we'll see Temporary Lockdown actually come up a little bit, just because it is pretty good at answering the Boros Auras deck. And we're bringing in 1 Storm Chaser's Talent, which allows us to kind of play. It works well in this one-of kind of strategy, where it kind of gives you a duplication of some of the spells that you have played. And then, as far as lands go, we dropped the Darker Waste, a Fabled Passage, an Island, Mirrex, and 2 Plains to bring in the Verge lands that we got in Duskmourn, as well as 1 additional Fountain Port, which can give us some late game value. As far as the matchups go, it's favored against the Rakdos Aggro deck and the Boros Auras deck, so maybe the 2nd copy of the Temporary Lockdown is not particularly necessary. It is a coin flip against Mono Black Discard. Again, like Jace and Silver Scrutiny help that matchup. Some Azorius Control lists aren't running that. And then it is weak to Azorius Oculus and weak to the Boros Tokens strategy, which is the one that's running the Caretaker's Talent that we'll cover here shortly. Number 6 this week was Abzan Control, and this one I thought was interesting because it's a relatively small sample size. It's definitely not a deck that is like, you're not going to bump into this deck a whole lot on your ladder climbs, but talking about these little off meta, or like, not necessarily off meta, these little off the beaten path, I guess, off meta picks. This one is really, really hating on any form of board-centric strategy. So it's going to lose to the Azorius Control deck and get milled out, most likely. But prior to this week, we didn't actually see a whole lot of Azorius Control. We saw it more than we did in Bloomburrow. But we basically have like White Sun's Twilight and Deadly Cover-Up for Wraths. And then we have Virtue of Persistence, Go for the Throat, Tear Asunder, and Cut Down for interaction. We have Ancient Cornucopia for life gain, Up the Beanstalk for card draw, and Sunfall. So we have 12 Wraths. So you just wrath the board over and over and over. And the win condition is solely off of reanimating something off of the Virtue of Persistence, or beating them up with the Sunfall, or winning through the manlands of like Mirrex and the Restless Cottage. So kind of an interesting take, and probably a blip. I wouldn't say that this one, I'd be surprised to see if this one was still there next week, but if you have the cards already, could be a fun one to play. Number 7 was Rakdos Lizards, and this one, same, no changes from week 1. We've already kind of covered this deck, but in case you're new to it, I'll just cover it really quickly. You're trying to deal 1 damage either off of the Hired Claw and the Iridescent Vine Lasher, to then be able to play a turn 2 Flame Cash Gecko, which then allows you to play another Flame Cash Gecko, and then a Gev or a Fireglass Mentor. So you get out, you have these very explosive starts, and then you have the Disruption of Cut Down, Go for the Throat, and Deep Cavern Bat to disrupt your opponent's plays, and Thought Stalker Warlock as well works really well in this archetype to have a coercion on a Menace body. So this works quite well against Mono Black Discard, being able to get your hand out before they have enough to deal with it, and this kind of playing like a go wide strategy off of the Flame Cash Gecko to an extent. So, and then you've got like the Fireglass Mentor, and being able to loot off of the Flamecash Gecko allows you to kind of filter to what you need. And then the Laughing Jasper Flint is in here to kind of improve the matchups against the mid-range and longer. Being able to dig off of your opponent's library then helps you find your opponent's removal to use on their creatures. So it's a little bit of a coin flip on Rakdos Aggro. I do think that bringing in more cut downs would be beneficial to that matchup. The issue is that you don't really want to be taking the turn off of... You're trying to get this explosive early start, because even if you delay a turn, a turn 3 Flamecash Gecko into playing out your entire hand is less impressive than a turn 2, right? So the cut downs kind of come in later after you've done your turn 1, turn 2, and that's why we see not 4, I imagine. And then it's weak against the Boros Auras deck because of that. Because your turn 1, turn 2 is playing creatures, if they're playing the Sheltered by Ghosts, you then don't have a really great answer to the Ward 2, especially because this deck doesn't usually get to an excess of lands particularly well. So you could bring in something like Shieldred's Edict. Shieldred's Edict and Liliana works pretty well against the Voltron. So you could kind of tweak this, but then it would make it worse up against other matchups. All right, and I've been a little rambly today, I apologize. The Boros Tokens deck is number 8, and so you can see Mono Black discard is above a 50% win rate. There's lots of decks that are above a 50% win rate that are all kind of in tier 2 land, and the first 3 that I mentioned, the Azorius Oculus, Boros Auras, Azorius Oculus, and Mono White Control, are all slightly above it in tier 1, but not by much. We don't have any like 60% winner that we see sometimes in best of 1. So, like I said, pretty balanced field if you ask me. But this was number 8. We do see some changes happening to this archetype as well. So another thing to keep in mind is if a whole bunch of things are changing to the archetype, you may want to wait and see where the final version lands if you are kind of limited on your wild card supply, and trying to manage not running out of those resources. So Archangel Elspeth got dropped by 1 here. We also dropped 1 copy of the Sunfall. Again, I think that the meta is not particularly well suited for Sunfall if you're dead by turn 3. If you're playing against Voltron, this card is particularly weak against Azorius Oculus as well, just because of the way that the deck is designed. It has one big threat that you need to answer, and so if you're using Sunfall 1 for 1, you're usually trading down in value instead of trading up. It's better if you're answering 2 or 3 cards with a single Sunfall. So if you use a Sunfall to get rid of 1 Haughty Djinn, and then next turn they bring back another Haughty Djinn, it doesn't work as well. So as we see more Azorius Oculus in the meta, we're likely to see Sunfall drop, especially because the go-wide strategies of like Rakdos Lizards and Celestia Rabbits and Boros Convoke have kind of fallen out of popularity. And but we're bringing in the Elspeth Smite, which does help up against the Rakdos Aggro deck. We're bringing in the Get Lost up to 4 copies, which helps as well. We're dropping 1 Urbrask's Forge, which I like because this one is better in the mid-range and control matchups, worse off in the aggro matchups. And we're dropping the 3 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty, which I also like better in best of 3 than in best of 1, because it's better for the mid-range and control matchups, worse against aggro. And bringing in 2 more copies of the Temporary Lockdown. And I'm surprised we haven't seen more Temporary Lockdown, because if you eliminate the Voltron by the thing that they're making into Voltron in Boros Auras is going to be mana value 1 or 2. So it works really well to wipe everything that they've played, and I'm surprised we haven't seen more of it sooner. As far as the lands go, we've dropped the 2 copies of the Demolition Field, 1 Fountain Port, and 3 copies of the Sunken Citadel. Really, I think this is just a little bit overkill for better in the mid-range to control matchups to be able to more cheaply activate your man lands. And instead we're going for more early mana so that we can have the Get Lost and the Torch the Tower and the Elspeth Smite. So we're bringing in the Battlefield Forge, 2 additional copies of the Myrics, 2 Plains, and 2 copies of the Restless Bivouac. And so this one kind of helps out against the control matchup, which this deck can have a little bit of a problem with. Depends if they have an answer for your Caretaker's talent. So this is favored against mono black discard, being able to draw a card every time off of Caretaker's talent, and they struggle to get rid of the enchantments anyway in black. Makes this pretty good against that matchup. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras and Rakdos Aggro, really depending on how your interaction lines up with whether or not you're on the play or the draw as well. And then it's weak against Azorius Oculus for the reasons I mentioned before. If you're answering with your Sunfalls 1-for-1, and that's if they don't just counterspell it. This deck can kind of lack the tools to disrupt that strategy. If you really wanted to hate on the Azorius Oculus or improve the matchup against Azorius Oculus, you could try like something exploring like Kutzel's Flanker, for example. All right, I'm a little bit behind schedule. I usually try to do 20 minutes on that, and I did 30. I'm a little rambly tonight. All right, so best of three. So best of three, what I like to do is, instead of using the tracker, which sometimes has a little bit of a low data problem in, you know, the meta is different on Arena than it is in paper, right? And so I think the standard challenge is, it's my preference. I prefer to watch the standard challenge each week as a way to kind of keep my eye on what's happening in best of three, because I think it more accurately reflects what we see being played in the Pro Tour, right? So maybe that's just my bias. If you disagree, let me know in the comments below. So number one on Friday that took down the standard challenge was Mono White Control by Gracias por Tanto, and we saw this last week. So it has grown in popularity this week, though. We're seeing several top 3 finishes by Mono White Control, and we see some changes. So they dropped 1 copy of the Archangel Elspeth, as well as 1 copy of the Eternal Wanderer, which works pretty well with the Beza, but is expensive. We're bringing in 2 copies of the Enduring Innocence. So this is what I was talking about. Usually we see innovation in best of 3, and then it trickles down into best of 1. So this one being a new card, kind of worth exploring. And I think some of them have him in the sideboard as well, and so it kind of depends on the matchup, but this is basically Wedding Announcement as well as a lifelink body. So I think that it's going to find a place somewhere. We've also brought in 1 copy of the Lorn of Third Path, which helps up against the artifacts like Urbrask's Forge and such. We got rid of 2 copies of the Parting Gust, and instead are running 3 copies of the Soul Partition, being able to bounce it until we have the answers later, or delay it until we have the answers later, and then getting rid of the Virtue of Loyalty. And the best of 3 sideboard, we've largely the same, except for we dropped the 2 copies of the Destroy Evil, got rid of the 1 copy of Not on My Watch, as well as 1 copy of Rest in Peace. I think 3 is overkill. Honestly, I think 2 is my sweet spot, but this works well against Azorius Oculus, and being able to get rid of their graveyard makes it so the Haughty Djinns have no power, and the Abhorrent Oculus can't exile anything from the graveyard. So this card kind of just wins you the game if you are up against Azorius Oculus. So that might be why we see sometimes, we saw 4 being explored last week and now 3. Maybe it's like that much of a win condition in that matchup that you just want to run all of them. So, because like they'd have to bounce it with the into the Floodmaw and then counter it, and like it's just not great for that matchup. We've got 3 copies of the Elspeth Smite. This helps up against like the Gruul Aggro decks, the Dimir Midrange, which is basically an aggro deck, and then we've got 1 additional copy of Lorn of the Third Path for answering Urbrask's Forge. Second place was taken by Mono White Control by Norman Carr. And if we compare this one to the list that I just covered by Gracias por Tanto, we can see they kind of went in a different direction. But notably, they don't have the Imidane's Recruiter in here, which is better for the Domain matchup. And we've seen kind of a decrease in Domain. It's still there, but it's maybe not as prevalent as it once was. And so this one is deciding to run all 3 copies of the Archangel Elspeth and bringing in a 3rd copy of the Enduring Innocence. We're dropping the Sanguine Evangelist entirely, which does synergize with the token off of Sanguine Evangelist, synergizes with the Caretaker's talent. But I also think kind of is a little bit odd in a deck that isn't necessarily going as wide. What I think is kind of weird is, so Virtue of Loyalty, I think is the payoff for going wide, and then we're running the Virtue of Loyalties, but not the Sanguine Evangelist, and then like, you know, like I would expect to see the Sanguine Evangelist and the Virtue of Loyalties, and not crossing them, well, you know, like taking one out but not leaving them in the other one, if that makes sense. I didn't say that perfectly, but anyway, yeah, so we're bringing in the Virtue of Loyalties, we're bringing out 4 Elegant Parlors and 2 Sunken Citadels, and really simplifying the lands, so we're just running 4 more planes, and we're bringing in a single Demolition Field. As far as the sideboard goes, we did a very different approach. The other one was more closely related to week 1, this one kind of doing its own thing. So we see that they brought out the Boonbringer Valkyries, which help with life stabilization, the Elspeth Smite, which helps with the early aggression. We took out 1 copy of the Lorn of the Third Path, so we still have 1 in the sideboard, but not as many. We've got the Enduring Innocence. We can bring up to a full 4 playset if it's a good matchup to do so. We've got the 3 copies of Exercise. Instead of like the Destroy Evil, I think we're just going to see Destroy Evil getting kind of replaced with Exercise going forward. And then Season of the Burrow, which has the ability to bring back a creature with an indestructible counter on it. And I also like that that card quite a bit with the Sanguine Evangelist specifically. But I think it could work on, you know, any of these creatures just having an indestructible is okay. You can also summon 5 tokens, and you can also exile problematic cards. So a lot of really good versatility from this card. We have 2 copies of the Sarah Paragon, which allows us to, if they don't have the graveyard hate and exile, but they have a lot of just instant, like single point spot removal that doesn't exile, so like, you know, black, outside of Anoint with Affliction, we bring in the Sarah Paragons. It may be better against red removal too. But anyway, we've also got the 2 additional copies of the Temporary Lockdown to hate on the early board flooding strategies. 3rd place was taken by Mono Red Aggro by Mana La Xiao, or no, Mana La Chao. Sorry, probably massacring the name there. So we haven't actually seen Mono Red Aggro in Duskmourn yet, and so we've seen this archetype before, and this one actually kind of a throwback to Days Gone by, right? We haven't seen the Godric and Squee combo for quite some time. So we still have the Heartfire Hero and the Manifold Mouse and the Emberheart Challenger, so we still have like the red mouse core. We have the Hired Claw, which works pretty well in the aggressive mono red strategy, kind of replaces like the Phoenix Chick from Days Gone by. It's kind of just like a superior version to Phoenix Chick. Monastery Swift Spear works well with the combat tricks and spells. So you've got Monstrous Rage, which is the best combat trick in red. And then we've got the Shock and the Lightning Strike for either removing problematic blockers or for direct damage. We have Obliterating Bolt for problematic blockers. And then we've got Squee and Godric as late game threats. And then the Witchstalker's Frenzy for 5 toughness problematic blockers like Shieldred. And then the Rockface Village in here, being able to repeatedly trigger the Valiant triggers for your mice. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got Lithomanic Barrage for your classic like white and blue hate. Pyroclasm works really well against the Rakdos Lizards deck, and I think is going to kind of... I wonder how much of this card just single-handedly takes Rakdos Lizards kind of out of the meta in best of 3. Urbrask's Forge, good against those mid-range matchups that struggle against artifact hate. So black especially struggles to get rid of artifacts outside of duress. And we've got Torch the Tower for early interaction, Obliterating Bolts if we need to bring in more early interaction and exile, and works pretty well against the Azorius Oculus deck, being able to get rid of something with 4 toughness and exile it so they can't bring it back with recommission and stuff. Case of the Crimson Pulse is good for the mid-range matchups where you need to kind of draw into additional gas. So first place on Saturday was taken down by Mono White Control by Gracias Portanto. So having a 2 really great finishes by them in the Mono White Control archetype. They didn't change anything in the main. The only thing they changed was in the best of 3 sideboard. So it was so small, we'll just cover it really quick. They dropped a Rest in Peace, which I agree with, and one Imidane's Recruiter, which I also agree with because we didn't actually see that much domain, to bring in an additional copy of Elspeth's Smite to help up against the aggro matchups, and one additional copy of the Sarah Paragon to be able to replay things from your graveyard. Number 2 was taken down by Mono Red Prowess by Poker's Wizard, and that was the same list as Mana Lachao on Friday, so we'll skip that one as well. And then we have number 3 here on Saturday was taken down by Orzhov Midrange by Back Off, and this one's also a new archetype for Duskmourn. We haven't seen it in the top 3. We're seeing this one is not running the Guardian of Gearpor. It's not running the Nurturing Pixie, so this is more of like the classic mid-range deck that we saw before people were exploring the Orzhov Pixie decks. And you have a lot of just disruption into mid-range threats, which are really problematic, right? So you've got like Aclazotz that keeps coming back. If you make it all the way to the late game, the Virtue Persistence brings things back that you've killed. You have a lot of interaction through Cut Down and Go for the Throat. You've got the Caustic Bronco, really works for like card advantage, where you can pay for life, or then you can hit into your top threats and hit for a lot of damage. So it can swing a game really quickly. You do need to have the Saddle 3, though, to be able to do the kind of like aggro attack, and works better with Gix, in my opinion, which this one is not running. So this one I don't think is leaning as heavily into the interesting thing about Orzhov Midrange is whether or not you want to go quickly or slowly. You can go with like the Bone Brute and things like that. Like people have explored doing a much faster strategy than this. This one going a little bit slower. So Zoraline being able to reanimate your threats. Preacher of the Schism gives you really great mid-range value. Drawing cards, giving the 1/1 lifelink cures, which are amazing chump blockers. Liliana of the Veil helps up against the control matchups, being able to attack their hand. Beza is really great stabilization against the aggro strategies. Same with Shieldred, if you can use your interaction to make it to turn 4. And then, yeah, that's pretty much the deck. And then the best of 3, we've got 4 copies of Duress. This deck can struggle a little against the control matchups, and so you would want to be bringing in all of the hand hate. Same with like Cruel Claw's Heist, the Hostile Investigator. Gix's Command works well against strategies like the Rakdos Lizards, where you can just destroy a whole bunch of creatures and give something +1/+1 in lifelink, and then further stabilize off of it. Lauren of the Third Path is in here for the post-board Forge, and we've got 4 copies of the Temporary Lockdown, which helps up against any of the early strategies, Rakdos Lizards, etc. Beza, the Bounding Spring, worse against the control matchups, better against the aggro matchups where you're using it for life stabilization. And then we have another copy of the Hostile Investigator. All right, now for Sunday's tournament, and we see an old favorite, a crowd favorite. We see the return of Golgari Midrange taking down first place by Squirtle19. And so it's been a little while since we actually saw the Rock up in the top 3. And it's just doing the thing that the Rock usually does, and we've got some interesting tools. So the Ghost Vacuum is, I think, a card that I would probably start in the sideboard as opposed to the main. But this card is good graveyard tech, kind of replacing the Unlicensed Hearse kind of vibe. And we've also got the Meat Hook Massacre from Duskmourn. I can't decide if it's actually as good as the original Meat Hook Massacre, but it can certainly be devastating. So for 6 mana, then each player sacrifices X creatures. So you just X equals 1 is 6. If you get to 8 mana, then it's like 2. But whenever a creature you control dies, you can return it under play with a finality counter. Same thing with your opponent. So if you pay the life, you get your creature back. If they pay their life, then you don't get anything back, but if they don't take the damage, then you get their creature. So it's kind of an interesting win condition, kind of fun to explore. But we've got the Mosswood Dread Knight, which is a huge like mid-range value engine. We've got the cut down and the Go for the Throat for interaction, Duress for up against the control matchups. The Vine Lasher in here, I think, feels slightly out of place to me because we're not doing a whole lot of like playing lands. There's a little bit of it. There was a Golgari deck that was like really about landfall, and anyway, I'm kind of curious to see how this one plays. And then we've got the hand hate for the Liliana of the Veil. The Free Strider Lookout, I think, is in combination with the Vine Lasher. Whenever you commit a crime, you can put a land into the battlefield tapped, and can kind of help you ping off of the Vine Lasher. Sentinel of the Nameless City was a staple in Golgari, and we're seeing only 2 copies being run here. 1 copy of Glissa Sunslayer, which is pretty common. We don't usually see a whole lot of multiple copies of Glissa Sunslayer making it in there. Harvester of Misery helps with the like Rakdos Lizards. Anything that has like a bunch of the 2 toughness creatures, the Harvester of Misery does a pretty good job of wiping the board. And you can also discard it to give something -2/-2 and then reanimate it later off of the Virtue of Persistence. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got another copy of Duress for against Control. Golgari kind of struggling against Domain. So since we're seeing Imidane's Recruiter being dropped out because there's less Domain in the meta, not super surprised to see Golgari like pop in and be like, hey, I'm still here, you know? So Domain's kind of the reason why we see Golgari not typically in the top 3. Terra Sunder gives us a nice artifact and enchantment hate, Choking Miasma, and is the Wrath of choice for this one for against like the Rakdos Lizards deck. Liliana of the Veil for control matchups. Ghost Vacuum if we really need to, like Azorius Control, Azorius Oculus, need to attack the graveyard. Anoint with Affliction if we're coming up against like the mirror match, being able to exile the Mosswood Dread Knight so it's like not recurring is always nice to have that sort of option. Tranquil Frillback works really well against any of the Caretakers decks, the mono white control decks that need the Caretakers talent. Works well against the aggro strategies by gaining the 4 life as well. And then also gives you graveyard hate like the Ghost Vacuum for Azorius Oculus. Hostile Investigator for up against Control to hate on their hand. And then the end is for anything that has a strategy that, like the Azorius Control that we're covering in Best of 1, its main win condition is off of Jace. And so if you can exile Jace and get rid of Jace entirely, then you don't have to worry about that one single win condition. All right, number 2 was Azorius Oculus by Dudu Denunu. And it's very similar to the list that we covered last week in the Azorius Oculus archetype. We've dropped 1 copy of Into the Floodmaw and 1 copy of Moment of Truth to bring in 2 copies of Get Lost. And strategy is the exact same as I covered in Best of 1. And as far as the Best of 3 sideboard goes, we have dropped the 2 copies of the Doorkeeper Thrall, which again is more helpful against the interesting ETB effects of like Domain. Dropped the 1 copy of the Soul Partition, and to bring in 1 copy of the Elspeth's Smite for against the aggro matchups, as well as 2 copies of the Monastery Mentor. And I think the Monastery Mentor is an interesting one. I don't know the matchup off, for certain, but my instinct is that this would be a good card to bring in against decks that have single point interaction that might be able to kill your Hadi Djinn or your Abhorrent Oculus, but struggle with the kind of go wide of the Monastery Mentor. And then last but not least is Gruul Aggro. So we have a number 3 finish on Sunday by Bucha. And is the exact same list as version 2 that I covered last week. So kind of taking a page out of the mono red strategy that we see in Best of 1, bringing in some additional dig of like Witch's Mark. Best of 3 needs a little bit more dig than Best of 1 does to consistently win after they sideboard in all of their interaction. And then the reason why we see this as opposed to the other mono red strategies is Snakeskin Veil. Although I do think because we have the Shard Master's Rescue, the white enchantment, we may start to see a Boros version creep in as well. The sideboard is mostly red with the slightest splash of Pop Hatch formation, and the sideboard is exactly the same as last week as well. So we've got Urabrask's Forge against the Midrange and Control, Twisted Fealty if they're playing something big like an Atraxa, Torch the Tower for early interaction. Good to bring in on the draw when you're going up against another aggro matchup. Obliterating Bolt if they have a problematic blocker that you need to exile. And yeah, Pop Hatch Formation for basically domain hate, being able to get rid of Up the Beanstalk as well as Atraxa. So thanks for listening to my ramblings. I went a little bit over this week, not too bad, but yeah, let me know in the comments below what you're feeling about the best of 1, best of 3 meta, how you're feeling, what your favorite deck is, what you're excited to check out. And I'll be on tomorrow to talk about the community deck techs. So if you submitted your deck there, thank you very much, and I'll be doing my best to get through them. I can only do about 4 a week, so we'll see which 4 win the raffle, if you will. And then it'll be on to maybe gameplay videos if I can get around to it. Otherwise, I'll see you on Sunday for the best of 1 meta breakers, where we'll talk about some off-meta picks that did well in week 2. So take care, everybody. Good luck with your matches, and I'll see you next week.